Good evening. Welcome to the Canadian Orthodox Broadcasting System and the Canadian Orthodox Monastery of All Saints in North America. This evening, before we go back to the Old Testament is About You, we're going to answer a couple of questions that have arisen from previous broadcasts. And someone asked me to say more about the Second Great Axial Period. And I had written about this subject around 10 years ago, there being a Second Great Axial Period that we found ourselves in. And really beginning from the era of the 1600s, from the Renaissance and into the developments of modern science, greater explorations of the Earth's surface and that sort of thing. Now, the First Great Axial Period, this is a definition given by existentialist philosopher Karl Jaspers, who was looking back at the age of the beginning of philosophy. And of course, philosophy and science began together. There were, proto-sciences around, but philosophy took the information from the proto-sciences and began the process of developing them into real science. And also, in a way, began to develop a concept of theology. That is a little bit more systematic way of thinking about the divine and thinking about the spiritual aspects of life. It was in that period of time when systems that we would now call ethics began to develop, and when people began to think more systematically about how civilizations could continue to exist and thrive and develop, how people could live together in these developing and slowly modernizing societies and cultures. And they developed the system of ethics, which really shaped itself into a concept of morality, which was beyond what we would call natural morality. And there were huge developments in philosophy, in religion, in the sciences, and in the structures of society during this lengthy period from about 800 to about 400. I think Jasper says to about 500, but I would take it to 400 BC. And it was in this era, too, when the philosophers, or the intellectuals of society, began to focus on the problem of the contradiction between good and evil, and how mankind could have could be so deeply good, could care so much for other people, could be so altruistic and self-sacrificing for the sake of others, and yet how mankind could really manifest such great evil. So the big question was, what is good and what is evil? Why do both coexist? And can anything be done about it? How can we define it in a way that we can really take it and do something with it? Increase the good, decrease the evil. And these questions were raised all the way from China to Greece and perhaps in other cultures that didn't leave us written records of it. But as we mentioned before, it was the age of Zoroaster who really focused on the question of good and evil, of Confucius, who was very concerned with how society should be structured and how it can continue and how it could be peaceful and just. There were other great thinkers of the era, of course the whole school of Miletus, which really was the foundation of modern science, and the age of Isaiah the prophet and some of the other great prophets. And in this era, the great prophets of Israel were trying to give a better understanding of the relationship between God and Israel, and thus the relationship between God and mankind. The revelation of God to Israel, and through Israel to the rest of the world, was a little different than a lot of people in Israel itself conceived it to be. The struggle between idolatry and the worship of the true and living God was about more than simply focusing on God himself, it was also about the kind of social justice that God had proclaimed to the nation, and moving away from a rigidity of simple external law to looking at the condition of the heart. And the great prophets were really quite focused on this. So this era transformed so much of humanity, and even restructured the way human beings think, the way they think about the world, the way human beings would think about each other, the way they would think about nature, culture, society, all these things. And actually the mode of thought, the way of thinking, was transformed through this era. Now, we enter into another axial period, and this comes about when there's an enormous transformation in knowledge and in understanding. And how we react or respond to this axial period, and we're well into it now, has a great deal to do with whether we continue to be able to fulfill our calling to proclaim the gospel. Whether we still try to do it in terms of the 16th century, the 17th century, the 1600s, when the axial period was well and truly underway by the 1700s. The 1600s saw this expansion of human thought. The 1700s tried to systematize it. So, in little by little, the mode of thinking itself, the way of thinking, has been changed and transformed. Never more dramatically than in the 20th century, when these two massive world wars and an almost constant warfare that could actually be observed, say on television or in movie news, as the Second World War and First World War were, and where there was a constant awareness, almost a presence, involved in these wars, and where they were so horrendous beyond anything the past could ever have imagined. And then the technological developments that followed rapidly after it. The mode of thinking, the way people think, has been transformed again. And I believe to the same degree that it was transformed by the first axial period. This, at least in my opinion, second axial period that we're in now, is really reshaping the human brain and the way that people think in ways that the first axial period could not have done. Because it took place not in isolation. There were no societies and cultures in a greenhouse. There was interaction between all these ancient societies from China to Egypt and beyond, and there were influence of one upon the other. But that influence was slow, moving, and filtered. It's much more direct, it's much more rapid now. And the impact is much greater and much more immediate, and it's taking place at a much faster speed. We think about the universe expanding at an enormous speed, but the Earth, cultures and societies, is shrinking at an enormous speed because the interaction and the change and the impact of different ways of thinking throughout the world are so immediate and so universal in their impact on societies and cultures. There are other things that add to it, which we'll discuss a little later when we discuss consumer capitalism and globalization. But I would like to ask Orthodox Christians in particular to think very seriously and actually meditate about and study the impacts of this new axial period and ways in which the Orthodox Church can react to it in ways that other Christian bodies simply cannot. The treasury of orthodoxy can give so much to this era and so much to this time if we only will.